and corporations, institutions, and other governments to cover their loans. There's always a shortfall. And the only way of the two ways to cover that shortfall is to increase the interest rates to make it attractive to get more money out of the private sector. And they don't want to do that because they don't want those high interest rates, because that would tend to dampen the money expansion mechanism, which is what they need to make money. They need money expanding, being loaned out at low interest rates. You don't have to charge an awful lot of interest on nothing to make a profit. So they don't care about the low interest rates as long as they can charge something. It's nothing that they're charging interest on. But they don't want to raise the interest rates, so there's a shortfall. That's the point. Now, when I started to research this, the shortfall was about 7% of all the money that the federal government borrowed. 93% was taken from sources where money already existed. The 7% had to go to the Federal Reserve System where money does not exist. Today, I really don't know what the shortfall is, because for some reason these guys are not telling. I can't imagine why they wouldn't disclose that, can you? They're not telling what the shortfall is, or at least I haven't been able to find it really. But I'm suspicious that it's probably today running 30 to 40% shortfall. And with the conversation that we're getting from countries like China and the Arab countries, other countries that have been big buyers of American debt, they're cutting back, and they're saying they're going to cut back completely. I wouldn't expect to see I wouldn't be surprised to see the shortfall climb to 60% or 70%, and eventually maybe 90%. It's hard to say. It's not too important because the process is the same either way. That shortfall is covered by the Federal Reserve System. So what they do is the Treasury official comes to the Federal Reserve, and as he walks in the door, now this is all figurative now, it's whimsical, okay? It doesn't happen this way, but I want you to picture it in your mind. It all happens in computers and maybe a phone call. But imagine that the Treasury official walks into the front door of the Federal Reserve Building, and the officer says, "Good evening, sir. We've been expecting you." Comes in there every day, you know. And once you come in, how much money do you want to borrow today? And the Treasury official says, "Well, let's see, looks at his watch, another $1 trillion will get us through till noon tomorrow." And the Federal Reserve officer says, "No problemo." Sits down, pulls out the drawer, big black checkbook, and he writes a check for $1 trillion to the United States government. Now bear in mind, this is all done in computers, but imagine this check, $1 trillion. Now the Treasury official takes the trillion, says thank you, deposits it into the banking account of the federal government. Now the government's got $1 trillion to spend. It looks like a loan on the books. But where did the Federal Reserve System get the money to loan to the federal government? And the answer, the amazing answer, is they don't have that money. They just created it out of thin air, out of heaven. And if you and I were to do that, we'd go to jail. But they do it because the politicians want them to do it. That's why they're in the partnership. They know, the politicians know that no matter how much money they need, whether it's millions, billions, or trillions, it makes no difference. They can always go to their buddies at the Federal Reserve System, and there it is, created out of thin air. In the old days, they used to run printing presses to do that. They'd actually have to print the money, walk around with wagons full, or drive around with wagons full of printed money. Now it's all done in the computer and in the inkwell. And so the politicians know that in spite of all of the talk we hear from time to time, oh, the federal government's running out of money, we're going to have to lay people off. If you remember that, it gets in the news periodically. Oh, what are they going to do for money? All they have to do is go to the Federal Reserve System and they got it in an instant. And that's what they do. This money that they're voting into existence today, we see these TARP programs and these bailout programs and these stimulus packages, where does that money come from? It's not coming from the private bond investors at all. It's coming from the Federal Reserve System. It's being manufactured out of thin air. So these guys never even question how much anything costs anymore in Congress, you know. They don't, when the issue comes up of Obamacare or a bailout program, do they really haggle over the price? They don't even discuss it. It doesn't make any difference because no matter what the amount is, they will get it from the Federal Reserve System. All right, so that's the first part of the Mandrake mechanism. This money is created out of nothing and given to the federal government. But do you think that's interesting? Here comes the second part now, which is even more spectacular. Let's follow $1,000 of that money that was created for the government and see what happens to it. Let's say that the postal worker that delivers our mail gets a $1,000 check from the government. Now to him, it's perfectly good money. A government check doesn't get any better than that. And so he takes it down to his local bank and deposits it into his private checking account. Now the money is out of the government cycle, the Federal Reserve government cycle, and into the private commercial banking cycle. And this is where it heats up. If I were the president of that bank, I could, if I wanted to, stand up in front of everybody there in the atrium of the bank, and I could say, attention everybody, I have good news. This gentleman over here has just deposited $1,000 into our venerable bank, and we now have money to loan. And of course that's good news because many people in the bank are there not to deposit money but to borrow money, and so they know that the more money the bank has to loan, generally the lower the interest rates and all of that. So that's good news. But let's say that this lady over here says, well, that's not going to help me any because I'm here to borrow $9,000. I'm looking at a used car and I need this car to get the kids to school and do some grocery shopping while my husband is at work, and I need to borrow $9,000, so I guess you can't help me. You only got $1,000. I'm going to go somewhere else. And if I were a proper banker, I would say, madam, don't worry about that. I can take care of you. Please have a chair at my desk. I'll be with you in a minute. And if she insists, and she said, but wait a minute, you said you've only got $1,000 and I want $9,000. How can you do that? I would say, do you want the money or not? So you notice that in the case of the federal government, when the government gets the money, they use it for their own purposes. I mean, they pay their salaries, they fund military campaigns, they have welfare programs, giveaway programs, medical programs, retirement programs, all these things, benefits to keep the voters coming back and approving of what they're doing. So they use the money for their own purposes. But the banks don't. They don't use any of that money for their purposes. They loan it to people like you and me, and corporations. But they collect interest on it. And that's why they're doing it. But just think of this for a minute. Interest on nothing. And so when the bank says, well, we only charge, we only get 3% interest on our money that we loan out, or whatever the rate is, that's nonsense, because they're only talking about that little 10% reserve. You multiply that by at least 9, and now you're coming up to a real interest rate on the amount of capital they actually own. The rest of that interest is collected on nothing, but they never tell you about that. They have a fantastic return ratio. And in spite of that, they're going broke. Incredible. It's because they don't worry about going broke. They know they're in partner with the government, and if they go broke, they'll just go get it from the taxpayers. That was the deal. That's the cartel agreement that Congress signed on to. So that's how money comes into existence, and of course there's a consequence to that. The consequence is that the money supply expands. Later we'll be talking about the fact that the money supply also has an ability to contract. And that we'll get into this deflation, inflation element then. And it's true that, when money goes out of existence, when loans are paid back, money goes out of existence. It's a fact that if all of the loans were paid back today, all of them, government loans, private loans, there wouldn't be one red penny of money in circulation anywhere. Nobody would have any money in their checkbooks. There'd be no money in their pocket. There'd be no money in the cash register drawers. There'd be no money anywhere, because all of it is based on debt. And if there's no debt, there's no money. That means that if money is paid back in the form of a loan, and you pay back your loan, the money supply for the whole nation decreases by that amount. Which is why they don't want you to pay back your loans, you see. Because if you pay back your loan, the banks make money only on collecting interest on loans. So if you pay back your loan, they got to find some other customer to take out a new loan. And so, anyway, the point of this is that the money supply is also contracting because loans